Hey, what's going on YouTube? It's Pastor Matt back with another daily dose of defense. Now today the guy that we want to talk about is a guy named Pamphilus. Now Pamphilus is he's an interesting individual. He kind of continued on with what Origen was doing, so much so that he copied a lot of Origen's works. By a copy, I mean he literally hand copied them with great care. So he was a big fan of Origen and what he had done, especially with Contra Celsum and his commentaries. Pamphilus was born somewhere in the late 3rd century, second half of the 3rd century, 250 and beyond. He was born to very wealthy, almost royal parents in Beirut, in what is now Phoenicia, or what was Phoenicia and now is Beirut. He received a good education. But once he was done with his education, he quit and he gave everything that he had to the poor and continued to work as a cleric, a priest of some sort. He went to Alexandria, where his teacher was Pierius, who was the head of a famous cathedral school. Settled in Caesarea, and he collected a really large library, some of which was copied by himself, carefully copied by himself, and he devoted he established a school for theological studies. He devoted himself to being very careful in his translation, not his translation, sorry, his writing of the scripture, his copying of the scriptures. He was so careful that not only did Eusebius express his zeal and his care in copying, but also St. Jerome did about a century later, a little over a century later. Jerome said that Pamphilus transcribed the greater part of the works of Origen with his own hand, and that these are still preserved in the library of Caesarea. So Pamphilus was taking the time to copy everything that Origen had so that it would propagate forth. He also took this time with the scriptures, so much so that what he would do is he would copy it down and then he would pass it out to people. He would hand it out the same way that people hand out a Bible on the street to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to have the scriptures in their hands. That is what Pamphilus was doing. So he makes for a very interesting individual, but also he shows that the scriptures are being passed out to individuals in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Now, this is something that, once again, I'm going to go back to that article we talked about in the first video, which shows the need for knowing this stuff. He is distributing the scriptures as he wrote them by hand to anybody who will take one. So we're seeing this early distribution of the scriptures. We see a careful copying of the original manuscripts, followed by this distribution. So the scriptures are going everywhere, and we've seen that at this point, all 27 of the books of the New Testament are considered to be canonical. So we cannot, at this point, we've got a rock solid case for the fact that these guys were interested in making sure that the Bible was going forth. Pamphilus would supply poor scholars with the necessities of life, right? And he would give them copies of the scripture, which he always kept in large supply, which he'd hand one out, which meant that he would need to copy another one, and so on and so on and so on. So he's being very careful here. So the great treasure at the Library of Caesarea was considered to be Pamphilus's hand-copied version of hand copying of Origen's works, and most notably his work was the Hexalta, which was the Old Testament copied in Hebrew and then in 5 different dialects of Greek. We know that we know that it existed at the time of Jerome and also on into the 6th century, but was most definitely destroyed in 683, sorry, 638, when the capture of Caesarea happened by the Saracens. But in the life of Pamphilus, the Diocletian persecution started in 303, and at this point, it's becoming bad to be a Christian again. So Diocletian, he is persecuting Christians. He's killing them all off. In 306, Appianus, who was a disciple of Pamphilus, he went in and he interrupted the sacrifice that was being made in the temple, and tried to talk the guy out of it, and he was put to death. Pamphilus was captured in 307. He was tortured profusely. In November of that year, he was tortured. This went on till about 309, when he was beheaded. He was beheaded after a young man named Porphyrius, who was his slave and disciple. Slave meaning servant, not slave as in we think of with American slavery. It is a servant. He was also a disciple. He'd been instructed in literature and writing, and he demanded the bodies of confessors for burial. He was then cruelly tortured and put to death. And of course, the torturers, they brought this news to Pamphilus, the master of the servant, just to kind of throw one more dig at him before they killed him. And then he was executed. He did write a few works of his own. Most notably is the Apology for Origen, or In Defense of Origen. And we can't confuse that, right? It is a defense of Origen, but the only book that is existing still today is the first book of it. He was sound in his doctrine with regards to the Trinity and the Incarnation. However, there were charges against his teachings, most notably is that he was a universalist. I think after I talk about Eusebius and the first full New Testament that we have, I'm going to talk about the fact that why universalism is so wrong, and how we can see, once we see that the scriptures are true, that that's not actually taught in the scriptures. Because once again, we can look at this and presuppose that the Bible is true, but we have to make sure that the Bible is what was written in the first century, and we're almost to the point of being able to trace that entire chain to the single existing text that we have from the 300s, from the 4th century, and we're gonna see that this chain was never broken. And that when we look at the Bible, we have the full, complete text as was intended by the writers of the New Testament and the early church fathers who have passed on the faith for the rest of us. This has been a daily dose of defense. Thank you for listening. God bless.